The U.S. military is one of the most powerful militaries in the world, and its presence is felt on a global level. Literally, it has bases set up all over the world, and they are unbelievable and also a tad controversial. As of the summer of 2021, the United States operated about 750 military bases in foreign countries. American Army, Navy, and air bases can be found on every continent except Antarctica. Other bases exist on the high oceans, although there are not as many overseas American military bases now as there were during the Cold War. More countries have since signed up to host them on their home soil. The presence of these bases in strategic areas is critical to American foreign policy, although they have been a source of controversy both in the United States and abroad. In this episode, we'll take a look at some of the more notable bases, their origins and importance, and the controversy that surrounds them. For the first entry of its existence, the United States was reluctant to entangle itself in the affairs of other countries outside of the Western Hemisphere. It maintained a policy of neutrality and did not have large permanent military missions overseas. That slowly began to change with the Spanish-American War. America's victory in that conflict saw its emergence as a bona fide world power with a military presence in Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Cuba. America's victory over Spain was the origin of the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, which opened in 1903 based on a permanent basis with the newly independent government of Cuba, which was then friendly to the United States. This makes Guantanamo the oldest American overseas naval base in the world. Since 9/11, it has become notorious for its detention center, where unsavory methods have been used on what the United States calls detained foreign enemy combatants in the war on terror. This designation is the justification for skirting the Geneva Convention and other treaties on the treatment of prisoners of war. The treatment of these prisoners was a source of partisan dispute in the 2000s and led to calls among some Americans to close the base. However, Guantanamo's controversy extends much further back than the War on Terror. Since taking power in 1959, the communist government of Cuba has repeatedly protested the base's presence on its soil. There is little that it can do about the base, however, as the lease will only end through mutual agreement or American abandonment. This is unlikely because in addition to its use in the War on Terror, Guantanamo gives the U.S. Navy a forward presence in the Western Hemisphere, with China increasingly interested in striking up partnerships with countries in the Americas. The United States will want to keep the base as part of a 21st century Monroe Doctrine, even if direct reference to that long tradition is no longer fashionable in Washington. The United States also maintains a presence in the Philippines, another tradition that began in the Spanish-American War. Spain's defeat led the Philippines to become an American colony with many military personnel stationed there. The Philippines achieved its full independence after the end of World War II, but there are still two small American bases there on both sides of Manila Bay. These outposts augment American power projection into the disputed waters of the South China Sea, where the Philippines is embroiled in a bitter international controversy with China over the latter's expansion into its exclusive economic zone and island-building campaign. This leftover legacy from the Spanish-American War is therefore more relevant now than it was during the Cold War, as the South China Sea becomes one of the biggest points of contention between the great powers of the 21st century. Although the United States began to assert a more formidable presence on the world stage after the Spanish-American War, it was not until World War II that it built large numbers of overseas bases that was only supposed to be temporary too, just as it was in the First World War. Even after its victory over Germany and Japan, America was slowly but surely beginning to retreat behind its traditional front volunteers until the Soviet Union and its allies tried to exploit post-war vulnerabilities. Containing the threat of communism became the highest foreign policy priority for Washington between the late 1940s and 1991. This priority was punctuated by the founding of NATO in 1949 and intervention in the Korean War in 1950. These policy shifts put the United States in the mode of permanent forward presence. The Korean War led to the establishment of a string of permanent bases in South Korea ranging all over the country. These include the Chennai Naval Base, 2 air bases, and a string of army bases, most of them near the DMZ, although the relevancy of these bases has been called into question in both the United States and South Korea. After the end of the Cold War, the United States' presence in that country is now more important than it has been since the fall of the Soviet Union, as China and North Korea make aggressive moves to undermine the post-Cold War international order. The bases in South Korea give the United States a presence on the East Asian mainland, which is critical for America's ability to counter China's military expansionism and North Korea's nuclear saber rattling. Similarly, Japan hosts Many American bases. There are over 50,000 American soldiers, sailors and airmen stationed in Japan, more than any other foreign country. The United States bases in Japan are concentrated on the southern island of Okinawa, but a few may also be found on the Japanese main island of Honshu. The bases originate from the United States' victory over Japan in World War II, its occupation of that country in the aftermath, and the subsequent Treaty of Alliance between them. This security treaty committed the United States to Japan's defense and allowed American bases on the latter's soil. In keeping with its pacifist post-World War II constitution, the arrangement was essentially for Japan to outsource many of its military functions to the United States. Japan could have a self-defense force, but not a military capable of offensive power projection. These functions will be taken care of by the United States. The American bases, especially the ones on Okinawa, have been the subject of controversy in Japan. Local Okinawan residents have long resented the base's environmental impact, noise pollution and incidents involving drugs and criminality that have escaped the jurisdiction of local courts. However, the bases in Japan, especially in Okinawa, are now more important than they were even in the Cold War, and not just for the United States, as the Indo-Pacific region becomes the center of great power competition in the 21st century. As an example, China has recently claimed it is the legitimate ruling authority for the Senkaku Islands in Japan's southern reaches. Even Okinawa itself has at times come under territorial dispute, with some Chinese authorities claiming that Japan has no legitimate historical claim to the island. Further afield, China's naval buildup that threatens Taiwan and the South China Sea trade routes also threatens to cut Japan, a relatively resource-poor country, off from the critical material it needs to import. America's bases in Japan are vital for both countries' ability to project enough power to deter and thwart China's AIMS in the region. America's bases in Japan once carried nuclear weapons, but these were removed in the 1970s. After controversy, growing competition with China has prompted some Japanese leaders, including the late former PM Shinzo Abe, to suggest that the nukes may need to return there as Japan pursues rearmament with a 2% of GDP target for its defense spending by 2027. It seems likely that the controversy of America's presence there will continue for the foreseeable future, as the Japanese people may see less of a need for the bases if they can take better care of their own security. Slowly but surely, Japan is reinterpreting the pacifist Article 9 in its constitution and becoming more militarily capable. The bases in Japan and South Korea have recently stirred controversy on the other side of the Pacific too. They came under increased scrutiny in the United States during the American presidential election of 2016. Their then candidate Donald Trump suggested that the United States was not getting a good deal on the bases, and that if South Korea and Japan did not pay more, it might be better for them to build nuclear weapons to defend themselves from North Korea and China. The statements rattled leaders in Japan and South Korea, but as the Trump presidency was characterized by increased competition with China, the bases became more important, and he did not make any moves to change the status quo during his time in the White House. The United States also maintains an extensive military presence in Europe, with bases in Portugal, Spain, the United Kingdom, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Greece, Poland, Lithuania, Romania, and above all in Germany, where around 35,000 American military personnel are stationed. Most of the German-based troops are hosted at Ramstein Air Base in southern Germany. It is the largest American military installation outside of the United States. This base had its beginnings in 1951 and was actually designed by a French and German engineers and an international work crew. The 3,000-acre base was originally a swamp, and the infrastructure needed to be built up by a height of 2 meters for it to be stable. Today, the base not only hosts American troops, but is an important site for many other NATO functions. Ramstein and other bases in Germany began as part of America's occupation of the country after the end of World War II, which is partly why most of them are still in the south of the country, which was the zone the United States was given responsibility for. Germany was at the center of Cold War tensions, making the American bases there more important and permanent. The bases gave the United States and its NATO allies the ability to rapidly deploy and supply the troops that will be needed on the front lines of a confrontation with the Soviet Union, which controlled all of Eastern Europe and much of Germany. But things have changed dramatically since then. The relevancy of Ramstein and other bases in Germany has been called into question in recent years with NATO's eastward expansion after the end of the Cold War. Many American policymakers on both sides of the political aisle, Donald Trump being the most well-known, have questioned the continued need for these bases, as Germany has persistently and stubbornly fallen short of the NATO mark of spending 2% of its GDP. On defense, meanwhile, the geopolitical fault line with Russia has shifted far to the east as the war in Ukraine and tension along the Baltic Sea shows even President Obama, who was very popular in Germany, derisively referred to the Germans and other NATO allies as free riders in a 2016 interview with The Atlantic for not owning up to their NATO defense spending pledges in response to Germany's negligence and new strategic reality. Some policymakers have called for the bulk of American troops in Europe to be shifted eastward to Poland, a country which is meeting its NATO obligations and is closer to the European geopolitical fault line of the 21st century. Initial moves of this sort were made in 2020 when some American troops were sent from Germany to Poland. The Poles agreed to fund some of the infrastructure and logistical support needed to make this happen. The move came as part of a broader redistribution of American troops around Europe. In June of 2020, then President Trump announced his intention to cut American troops stationed in Germany to 25,000, with a redistribution of about 10,000 of them to bases in Belgium and Italy. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Germany announced that it would modernize its military and spend 2% of its GDP on defense. But over a year later, the math still does not add up, according to the German Economic Institute, a think tank based in Cologne. In March 2023, Germany put its pledge in writing. To show more seriousness, however, there are still skeptics who say they've heard this before. As of the autumn 2020, Greece, the United Kingdom, Romania, Poland and Lithuania were the NATO countries with American bases on their territory that met the 2% target. Perhaps this is why the bases there are less well known or controversial. In the United States, one of the more important bases in the region is in Chiglik Air Base in Turkey. The base's official mission is to defend NATO's southern flank. Incirlik originated in 1943 when Allied leaders agreed that a new air base south of the Turkish capital Ankara should be built. Construction began in 1951 and Turkey joined NATO in 1952. This base serves as a host to some of the United States' tactical nuclear weapons like the B-61 bomb. It also allows the American and Allied air forces to project power into the Black Sea, the Caucasus, and the Middle East, making it an important piece on the geopolitical chessboard and a check on Russian and Iranian influence. Although the relative importance of the theater has decreased in the wake of the rise of China in Asia and a more aggressive Russia in Europe, the United States maintains a significant military posture in the Middle East. It has a presence in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iraq, Israel and Jordan. All told, there are about 7,500 American soldiers, sailors and airmen stationed between these bases as of 2023. The naval bases in Bahrain and Dubai in particular allow the United States to project rapid power into the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, which sees the transit of a third of the world's liquefied natural gas and 20% of the world's crude oil. The United States naval presence there acts as a check on Iran and, in a more extended way, China, since most of the outbound energy products in these waters are on a course for East Asia. The presence of these bases grows further in importance for the United States when it considers that China built its first overseas military base, the People's Liberation Army Support Base in Djibouti, several years ago, and is continuing to expand its capacity. As of 2021, about 2,000 Chinese military personnel was stationed on this base, and it is expanding its capabilities, although the advent of shale energy has reduced the strategic importance of this oil-producing region for the American energy supply, keeping the waters of the Red Sea and Persian Gulf from drifting too far into China's orbit means that the Middle East will remain an important region for American foreign policy. The United States also operates the Diego Garcia Naval Base jointly with the United Kingdom in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Technically, it is United Kingdom territory. Diego Garcia has its origin in 1814 when the British gained control of it, and the atoll it is part of from the French. In 1965, Diego Garcia officially became the British Indian Ocean territory, and the following year it was agreed that the United States and Britain would create a joint naval base there. Construction began in 1971. The local inhabitants were expelled from the island. As part of this process, the base's mission is to provide critical support to U.S. and Allied forces forward deployed to the Indian Ocean, while supporting multi-theater forces operating in the CENTCOM, AFRICOM, EUCOM and POCCOM areas of responsibilities in support of overseas contingency operations. The mission statement is a bit clunky, but otherwise apt, because Diego Garcia allows the Allies to project power on the crossroads between Africa's south Asia and Australia. In the event of hostilities, Diego Garcia is another installation which would allow for a rapid deployment to disrupt the ocean-going trade that China depends on. Ships from Diego Garcia would be able to move rapidly to the Persian Gulf or the Strait of Malacca, for instance, and cut off vital shipping lanes. Meanwhile, since China has been making significant investments on the African continent, including with plans for more military bases, the Diego Garcia Naval Station acts as an important check on China's ambitions in the region, and its presence is something the Chinese leadership will need to take into consideration when it makes its plans for Africa and the Indian Ocean. The United States does not have much of a permanent presence in Africa, but it does have a few. A particularly interesting base is Camp La Monnier in Djibouti on the continent's Horn. The base supports about 4,000 active personnel and allows the United States to project power directly into the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, supplementing the Middle Eastern bases. Camp La Monnier began as a French military base before the armed forces of Djibouti took it over. In the early 2000s, the United States established itself there to conduct counter-terrorism operations on the Horn of Africa as part of the Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa (CJTF-HOA). Now, as the United States shifts its strategic posture away from the war on terror and toward great power competition, Camp La Monnier takes on a new importance, as we have also seen this base as close to China's only overseas base, allowing the United States to more easily monitor and quickly check the activities of its primary strategic competitor. It is another example of an old base being refit for a new purpose. The United States is by far the world's largest military spender, with over $750 billion allotted to its armed forces in 2020. Much of its spending is on the overseas deployments that we've discussed. Overseas military deployments have been a subject of controversy on both sides of the political aisle in the American homeland, especially after the long counterinsurgency campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan that left the American public war-weary. Many Americans wonder why the United States spends so much money on overseas military commitments instead of taking care of needs in the homeland. This is a tendency that has been strong ever since the foundation of the American body politic, and most famously expressed in George Washington's 1976 farewell address, when he told the nation he wished to steer clear of any permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. The United States became the world's unwilling and accidental superpower in World War II, but its founding fathers' words remain a big part of America's psyche. Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed the political chessboard somewhat, as most Americans support arming the Ukrainians and checking Russia's further ambitions in Europe. Most Americans also recognize the dangerous China poses, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, there is still an extreme reluctance for new overseas combat missions by the American military, as America's allies like Japan and Germany pledged that they will rearm and therefore bring their own checks to foreign adversaries like China and Russia. The American overseas bases may be called further into question by people on both sides of the ocean. The American people could feel less of a need for their expense, while those in other countries may feel less of a need for their security presence and the environmental and social costs that come with them. Time will tell, though it's unlikely they will be going anywhere soon. But what do you think about America's overseas military bases? Which ones have grown more or less important, and are some of them still necessary?